Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Deborah Woolen, and I am your host this evening for Inside Scoop. Anyone who knows me, they've heard me say that time is our most valuable asset. If you ask most people, they might say money, but I'll follow that up with, if you lose $5, you can get $5 back. But if you lose 5 minutes, you will never get that time back. You will never get those 5 minutes back. Imagine if those 5 minutes were translated into 900 years. That is the amount of time that the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project has saved by exonerating 44 men that were essentially found not guilty of crimes that were put against them. So this evening we have with us the Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, Shawn Armbrust.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. I know that we've been talking before the show, and I really can't wait to delve into the conversation, but gosh, the work of the Innocence Project is just so vast, and you all do such great work. But before we even get into that work, what was the path that led you to become the Executive Director?
So it was, like many things, very serendipitous. I was a college senior at Northwestern University. I was a journalism major, but really I was a political junkie. So I'd spent time interning in DC. I thought I wanted to go work for a 2000 presidential campaign. And I had to take another credit in the journalism school. And my choices were magazine writing or investigative journalism. And that was a class where you got to reinvestigate old murder cases to see if there'd been a wrongful conviction. Seemed better than writing, right? Didn't expect to get that into it. And clearly I did. I think the first week of the class got to meet two people who had spent time in Illinois prisons. One of them spent 18 years on death row for a double murder they didn't commit. And I just was hooked.
And this was your journalism class?
Yes.
Interesting.
So I signed up to work on the case of a man who had been scheduled for execution 50 hours before we started class and had received a stay at the last minute because there was a possibility that he was mentally retarded. At that point, his innocence wasn't even relevant to his legal claims anymore. And he ended up exonerated 4 months later while we were still in school, and I fell in love with the work. It wasn't just winning. Winning is fun. But I loved the investigation. I loved reading the transcripts, and it also just made me so mad that I wanted to keep doing it.
Yeah.
So I went to work at the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern. From there, went to law school at Georgetown in DC, and then kind of found myself doing this at the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project.
Wow. And so you said it just made you so mad. What part of it just kind of ignited that emotion within you?
So there were quite a few parts. One of the first things that struck me about the case was it was a young African-American couple that was murdered, and then a young African-American man who was convicted and sentenced to death. There was so little media coverage. We were a journalism school. One of the first things we did was do, a search for newspaper stories. And it was just it didn't even really rate on anyone's radar. His lawyer was, the family had mortgaged their house to pay for a private lawyer so that he wouldn't have a public defender, which public defenders are usually better. Mm-hmm. That's my tip for anyone who's watching.
Wow.
But the lawyer did almost nothing. And it was just so depressing to see that all of these lives, even the investigation was it just wasn't very robust, right? And all of these lives were treated really cavalierly. The victim's mother had believed for years that our client was innocent, and no one really cared or believed her. And just seeing how badly everybody involved was served while the real perpetrator walked free ended up abusing his wife.
Oh my
It just,
gosh.
the whole chain of events was just so awful. And then at some point in there, I had to testify before a grand jury. And as you know, an upper middle class white girl, I got a subpoena. I freaked out. I called my dad and immediately had like a great lawyer for free. And just like the difference between, you know, what I got testifying before a grand jury with no criminal exposure to anything at all versus what a man got who ended up almost executed just blew my mind. And it just made me angry.
Wow. And so then fast forward, you're working for the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project. Like what was the trigger?
So I had gone to law school to do this work. I clerked for a federal judge for a year, and this position was open. And it was a fledgling organization. I was the only employee. Wow. And I was barely qualified to be a lawyer. But I had a really great set of board members and mentors, and we've just kind of slowly and steadily grown, and there are now 14 of us, and we're doing really incredible work.
Wow. I would definitely agree that it's incredible. As I mentioned, over almost 900 years of time served that you've saved. It's around 44 people now?
That's right.
Gosh.
Yeah.
And so the Mid-Atlantic, specifically Innocence Project, started what year? Because I know there are innocence projects like all over the country, right? So talk about how Mid-Atlantic is kind of like different from everyone else.
So the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project covers cases in DC, Maryland, or Virginia where people are convicted of crimes they didn't commit. And we will take cases whether there's DNA evidence or not to prove innocence, which historically the Innocence Project, based in New York, has handled cases all over the country, but have typically handled only DNA cases, though they've now kind of branched out to broader forensic science issues. And there are other innocence organizations all over the country. There are 59 US-wide, 70 across the world, with a similar mission and a similar name. We are all totally different organizations, so separately funded, separately structured, but all doing the same work and kind of working toward the same mission.
Wow. So, okay, there's just so many branches, so many different directions that we can go in. What does the process look like? Does someone say, do they call? Do they send an email? Do they say, hey, I'm innocent? Like, what is the process once you all receive a request, essentially?
So most of our requests come via letter from prison. We do have some requests that come other ways. So sometimes, you know, once we were contacted by a prosecutor who was worried that he'd convicted the wrong person.
Wow. We've
been contacted by defense lawyers. We've been, you know, contacted by other officials. There have been kind of special audits of certain types of cases. But the bread and butter is people in prison writing to us and saying that they're innocent. And our job is to figure out in which of those cases the person is innocent and in which of those cases we can actually prove innocence. Because of course, me thinking that you're innocent doesn't cut it, right? I've got to be able to prove it. I kind of joke in the office, like, evidence, not vibes. And that's really what we've got to have. So a lot of our time is spent, you know, looking at the documents they have, getting documents from lawyers, from courts, from police departments, from prosecutors' offices, and then just getting out in the field and talking to witnesses. We have a team of 3 investigators who are amazing, and that is really like where kind of the magic happens.
Wow. I imagine that's, well, let me ask, is it difficult to kind of visit police departments and kind of like reopen these cases? I imagine that it's going to upset some folks.
Yes, it does. You know, it's human nature, right? Like, most people who are going to become prosecutors or going to become police officers don't go into it thinking, today, I would like to send someone to prison for something they didn't do. But I think all of us are human, and all of us are susceptible to tunnel vision. And so when the system and the actors in the system have decided that a person is guilty, talking them out of that can be really hard. And we've done it a lot of times, but it's tough. And people don't want their work to be re-examined. No one wants to be told that they did something that helped send someone to prison for 30 years. But we are lucky that public information laws are a good resource. So in most of our cases, I mean, court records are public, so we can request those. And we can also do Freedom of Information Act requests for police files and prosecutors' files. And so that's where we get most of the information. We don't actually have to like convince the detective on a case to give us the file, because that's usually kind of tough.
Yeah. You know, you said something interesting. You said that for the most part, we don't think that someone wakes up in the morning and they make the decision, or they say to themselves, I want to convict someone or send someone to prison for something that they didn't do. But I would imagine that there is a sector within our population that would disagree with that. That we believe that maybe some people do want to look at someone based upon the color of their skin and then determine, because I hate you, because I have the power, I'm going to make sure this person doesn't receive justice. In your work, have you seen, and I'm getting a bit ahead of myself,
no, it's all good.
In your work, have you seen kind of like, what are the racial implications? What are some of the patterns?
I mean, race is huge in our work, and it can be really complicated to talk about, because the innocence movement has tended to traffic in, like, what can we quantify? So, out of 10 cases, we know that 3 involved a witness who made a mistake, and 2 involved a false confession. And there are times when we literally can point very specifically to race being involved, right? Wow. Marvin Anderson in Virginia legitimately became a suspect in the case because a white woman who was raped by a black man mentioned to police that the perpetrator said he liked to date white women or had a white girlfriend. One of the police officers knew Marvin had a white girlfriend. And there that was it.
Oh my gosh.
We have a client in Baltimore, Ransom Watkins, who, when he was interrogated by detectives, one of them said, you've got 2 things against you. You're black and I have a badge. So that's easy, right? I think where it's harder is that, in the US, we have such a long history of associating blackness and criminality, particularly black men. And people are very willing to believe that black men did things that aren't really logical, or that they don't have evidence to support.
I know that you do not want to go anywhere. This is such a great conversation full of so many perspectives. Please make sure you stay right there. Come back as we continue our conversation with the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project.
Old man Hennessy's window.
Correction, dude. You broke. I just threw the ball.
This is really bad. What are we gonna do?
We? Go to the door, ask for the ball back.
Are you serious?
It's my ball, Myrtleback.
You're so dead.
I'd run away.
Yeah, to Uruguay.
Kiss your life goodbye. Sorry.
Let's go. See you, dude. See ya. Remember me and your well.
Nice life. Some friends you are.
Hi. Tell him it was an accident, and we can fix the window. Come on. I'll come with you.
Loyalty. Pass it on.
You go first.
A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Only you can prevent wildfires. Fire.
Awkward. I'm the awkward silence. You try to avoid me, then there I am again.
But an awkward silence can be a great thing.
Like Kelly here is about to demonstrate.
You haven't really been yourself lately. Are you okay?
Find out how you can help a friend with their mental health at seizetheawkward.org.
We're back. to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Thank you so much for coming back and joining us on Inside Scoop as we continue our conversation with the Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, Executive Director Shawn Armbrust. I'm going to get that name right. I keep saying it.
You are so much better than 99.9% of the people I know.
I'll take it. So before we left from our previous segment, we were talking about the racial disparities within our criminal legal system. And we were just talking about how we can't ignore the patterns that take place when it comes to kind of injustice that certain people within our population, African Americans specifically, not that that's the only group, but we're talking about from a numbers perspective, statistically, just the egregious situations that happen. As you mentioned before we left, there was someone that said to, I think, a defendant, "You've got two things against you. You're black and I have a badge."
Yes.
So just kind of like wrapping that up again, like just helping people understand that we're not making this up, essentially. Like this is an issue.
This is an issue, and that was a case in Baltimore City where there was a school shooting and at a junior high, and it was awful. A kid was killed for his Georgetown jacket in 1983, and there was a ton of pressure on police to solve the crime. They thought that the perpetrator was someone who was in the school and wasn't supposed to be, and they got tips about who it really was. But they had fixated on 3 kids who they'd heard were in the school and weren't supposed to be: Ransom Watkins, Alfred Chestnut, and Andrew Stewart. And even though the 2 witnesses to the crime said it was one person, so police were initially looking for one person, police just locked in on a theory, and the theory didn't make any sense. But I don't think they saw Ransom, Andrew, and Chestnut as human beings the same way that they would have seen teenage me as a human being. And so I think they assumed that, of course, they'd shoot this kid for a Georgetown jacket. And I don't think that would have been the case if they'd been white. And I can't prove that, right? I can't quantify that. I can't point to where in the record there's evidence of that. But I don't think they're convicted if they're white. Even, this is a case where, these were kids. They were 16 years old. And David Simon, the creator of The Wire, in the book Homicide, actually wrote about Ransom Watkins, our client. And he had been taken in for questioning. There was some kind of prison riot, and they were just talking to everybody. And David Simon happened to be in the room when Ransom was being interviewed and described Ransom as a 19-year-old monster, remembered the crime, and just the way he talked about Ransom, it's the way you think about people being talked about in 1850 or 1920 or 1940. Those same stereotypes, and you see it in all of our cases, or many of our cases. It's a historical through line, and it just is part of our country's history, and we have to be open about it.
Wow. It just kind of reminds me of, like, what comes to mind is like the court of public opinion.
Right.
And we can't talk about exoneration without thinking about the exonerated 5, the 5 young men that were convicted of raping, brutally raping a white woman who was a jogger. And then Donald Trump taking out this, ad for their death, essentially. But to still kind of deal with those same kind of patterns of people being wrongfully convicted, it makes you ask, like, what happens? Like, what are the things what are the triggers? And so on your website, it talks about, like, what are the causes of these wrongful convictions? And there's a list of them, but the 3 that kind of, like, I could think of cases or instances in the media where there's eyewitness misidentification, unreliable or improper forensic science, and government misconduct. So of the causes listed on your website, what are maybe the most prevalent or the most egregious?
So I think the most egregious really is government misconduct. And I will say I don't love to use the word misconduct because I do think sometimes the indifference is more disturbing to me than intent, because it's not necessarily people meaning to do it, but it's that it's just kind of rushed, and often, you know, there's not necessarily a focus on whether you're getting it right. But government misconduct in these cases most often takes one particular shape. So most people don't know that in a criminal trial, the Constitution doesn't guarantee the defendant the right to see it doesn't historically, like, hasn't guaranteed the defendant the right to, like, know who the witnesses against them are. You know, it's very, very different than civil trials where you have depositions and everything's, you know, the other, you know what the other side has. In a criminal trial, you don't. And the only constitutional protection the Supreme Court has found in that area is that there's a due process right to know going into trial what information that we know about exculpatory information. And what that means is that the government is supposed to turn over to you any information that could be helpful to you. And the government is in charge of deciding what information is helpful to you. Sometimes the government doesn't understand why something might be helpful to you. The other problem with the standard, though, is that you only learn about it after the fact, right? Because the government has it. So if you happen to find out about it after the fact, and you can challenge your conviction with that evidence, which is usually evidence of innocence, the government still only loses the conviction if you can prove that the information that was withheld was what they call material. So if the judge decides that the information might have made a difference to the jury, that's the only reason it gets overturned. So most prosecutors, when they're making the decision about what to turn over, are going to look at it and say, well, okay, that might help, but, like, is it material? And they may strategically hold it back because they decide it's not material, and they'd rather not turn it over, right? And that system, first of all, like, allows for a lot of errors because it's a terrible system. But second of all, the people who do want to break the rules, it's pretty easy to do it if you want to do it, because who's going to find out? So the reason I talk about that specifically is that, you know, our system is designed around the idea that, you know, a jury trial is a great way to sort out what the truth is. And, you know, if you have a robust defense, then you can really get there and the two sides duke it out. But if the defense has one arm tied behind their back because they don't know that the eyewitness who's testifying for the government initially identified somebody else, or that the forensic scientist has a history of failing their proficiency exams and getting things wrong, or that the jailhouse informant has testified in 6 other cases and people supposedly confessed to them. If the defense doesn't know any of those things, then there's not really much to the right to a defense. So, you know, I think it's like sunshine is the best disinfectant. I'm sure I'm getting the phrase wrong. But without a transparent system, it can't work. And so to me, that is the biggest problem, is that it is just so secretive and there's just so little information sharing. Like, I can get more information about a case after someone is convicted than their defense lawyer can get before the trial. And that's crazy.
That is, because at that point, the person's been convicted, they're in jail, their life has been changed forever. And then what is the likelihood of a case being overturned once there is a conviction?
It is very hard to overturn a case once someone is convicted. So the system is also predicated on the idea that we get that basic question of guilt or innocence right at trial. And so when you hear about criminal defendants having all these appeals, blah, 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 they're not really given the opportunity to challenge their guilt or innocence You know, they're first to give it an opportunity to challenge things like, you know, was this search and seizure proper? Should this evidence have been admitted? And that doesn't really go to guilt or innocence. And then after that, you lose the right to a defense lawyer. So all of the other appeals that people hear about, people are navigating on their own from prison, right? And they're complicated. So in Virginia, for example, the trial court can't really do anything in a case more than 21 days after you're convicted. And you only have 1 year to like raise a constitutional challenge in Virginia state courts or in federal courts. You can, if you have newly discovered evidence of innocence, challenge your conviction, but it's a really high burden, and you've got to, you know, people try to do it on their own, but you've got to find somebody who will do it for you realistically. So it's really tough. While I'm on here though, I do want to give a shout out to the Northern Virginia prosecutors, who are doing things differently. So you have, you know, a group of progressive prosecutors who were first elected, I guess, 4 years ago. And I can't name any of them. I can't endorse things. I have a nonprofit. But they really are prioritizing transparency and trying to make sure the system works the way it's supposed to. And I think, you know, that's a credit to the voters of Virginia for wanting a more transparent system, or Northern Virginia at least.
Wow, thank you for that shout out. But you raised a really good point as far as just how hard it is and how long it takes. So let's just say someone contacts the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project. What's the typical time frame? We're not talking about 6 months. We're not talking about 60 days. Like, what's the typical time frame that could, for a possible overturn of a case?
So I'll give you an extreme end. We had a client who was exonerated in April. He'd been out of prison for several years on parole, but he was exonerated, and he first wrote to us in 2004. You know, we were a one-person organization back then. We were very small, but it also took just years to investigate the case. The state's key witness had kind of a journey, and he was really afraid of talking, and he, you know, we didn't want to put pressure on him, right? Because that's not good. We don't want a false statement out of him. But we, you know, over time, were able to kind of develop a relationship with him, and he admitted to us that he'd made it up. And that finally was the catalyst for getting him out, or for exonerating him.
Wow. Please make sure you don't go anywhere as we continue our conversation with Shawn Armbrust, the Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project. When we get back, we'll talk about the different legislative victories that this wonderful organization has been able to succeed in Virginia, DC, and Maryland. Don't go anywhere.
It's a beautiful day out here. Sunny today with light breezes, giving way to clouds in the afternoon. We could see some light precipitation to moderate precipitation later on, followed by powerful storm-like conditions. 90 miles per hour winds are expected. Authorities are asking everyone, stay indoors. Come on, that's it. Let's go.
Oh, Dad, wait till you see the bike we got for Jake.
Hearing loss happens gradually with age, making it easy to ignore. Yet most older Americans aren't getting their hearing tested. Untreated hearing loss can keep your loved ones from enjoying what they cherish most.
Dad, can you hear me?
Don't let that happen. Speak up about hearing loss. You'll be glad you did.
You can't buy a best friend. You can love them, pet them, care for them, whether they want you to or not. You can take a picture, you can jump, yell, you can fly to the moon, travel the world, or just stay in bed. You can't buy a best friend like that, but you can adopt one. 'Cause we're connected.
Cook foods to the right temperature using a food thermometer. 3,000 Americans will die from food poisoning this year. Keep your family safer. Check your steps at foodsafety.gov.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
And thank you so much for coming back and joining us as we continue our conversation with Shawn Armbrust, the Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project. And before we left, we were just talking about just the process of someone after they're convicted, just the likelihood of their case being overturned. What are some of, before we get into the legislative victories that your organization has been able to accomplish in Virginia, DC, and Maryland, what, just generally speaking, what are some of those roadblocks? Why is it so hard?
So there are a lot of reasons why it's so hard. I think the overarching reason, though, is that we as a society have decided that procedure matters more than justice. So the overwhelming narrative you hear is that all of these prisoners are filing so many challenges and it's clogging the courts. And I don't deny that, like, the courts are very overburdened. I think if we charged fewer people with, if we had fewer crime, if we charged fewer people, we'd get there. But so the goal in most of these, with most of these things, is to make sure that people cannot win. So they create a bunch of procedural hurdles out there that are designed to keep people in. So, one example is you have to prove that evidence is newly discovered if you want to win what's known as a writ of actual innocence in Virginia. And newly discovered means it couldn't have been discovered by you or your lawyer. Well, how do we know what a lawyer could have discovered? And why are we punishing someone if their lawyer just didn't quite do enough work? And you would think, because one of the other ways you can potentially prove innocence is by proving that your lawyer was ineffective. And that if your lawyer had investigated better, your lawyer would have found this evidence of innocence. But it turns out, specifically, this is in Maryland, but I think it would be the same in Virginia. Your lawyer can be like perfectly fine, he should have discovered this evidence at trial, but also can be, sorry, I messed that up, sorry. Your lawyer can, on one hand, the court can say, your lawyer should have looked harder for this evidence, it's not newly discovered. On the other hand, the court can say that your lawyer should have worked harder, or that your lawyer didn't work hard enough. So, sorry, I'm mixing it up.
Okay.
But basically, there's a gap, and there's a place where your lawyer was not good enough, and your lawyer was fine, and there's this place where just nobody fits.
Wow.
And it doesn't matter. There are stringent deadlines about when you have to find evidence. And, if you're innocent, it really shouldn't matter, but it does. If you don't file by those deadlines, you're punished. But if you do file by those deadlines on your own, and then you file again, you're punished for filing multiple times.
Gosh.
You have to raise all of your claims in state court to have something called federal habeas, which is a constitutionally guaranteed right. If you don't raise all of your claims in state court, then you can't raise them in federal court, even if you found out about them in federal court. So we have one case where we were in federal court because he'd lost in state court, and then we found new claims. So we had to go litigate for 4 years in state court, lose, and then come back to federal court so we could win. And it's massively inefficient, and it takes years to litigate, and you don't always win.
Wow.
So it's really tough.
I think what's heartbreaking about the fact that it just takes so long, just as I mentioned before, these people, they don't get their time back.
Right.
So just the kind of the egregious processes and just the lack of due diligence, and these people are just kind of rotting in prison, essentially.
Right.
The burden is upon them to prove their innocence, on top of just the toxic environment essentially within a jail. So thank you so much for all of the work that you do.
It's so complicated that I couldn't even explain it coherently, and it's what I do for a living. So
could you imagine having to go through it?
Exactly. Yeah, do it from prison while you're in prison for something you didn't do.
Gosh.
And you know, maybe you graduated from high school, maybe you didn't, but it's hard stuff.
Right, exactly. So kind of segueing into the legislative work that the Mid-Atlantic, maybe we'll just say MAIP, that
That's
MAIP
great. Love it.
does. So I know that in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, those are the three areas that your organization focuses on. On your website, you list some of the legislative victories that you all have had. So as I was reading them, it's just interesting that these things had to become laws, that they're not already a thing, essentially. For example, in 2004 in DC, you all helped kind of, I guess, essentially make it a law requiring the mandatory recording of interrogations in DC. So before 2004, that wasn't a thing.
It is still not required in Virginia or Maryland. So DC was actually one of the first places to adopt the mandatory recording of the full interrogation. So recording an interrogation doesn't necessarily stop someone from falsely confessing, but it preserves the record. And when you're trying to figure out whether somebody falsely confessed, you really want to look at that full record. So a lot of the time before 2004, what they would do is interview somebody for as long as they needed to, and that could be an hour, that could be 20 hours. And then once they're willing to make a statement, record it. So you get the statements are like kind of like people who are just kind of numb at that point and almost clinical about it. So they look really bad. And most of the time they're accurate, but like they look bad. And when they're not accurate, it's really hard to piece together and explain to a jury or a prosecutor or even a defense lawyer how you ended up confessing to something you didn't do.
Wow.
But when you see it play out on video, it makes so much more sense. So it's required in DC. Police were initially super against it. Now they love it.
Wow.
Because you've got video evidence of someone confessing. And most of the time, they're confessing because they did it. So it's pretty common sense, but a lot of people have really resisted it.
Gosh, which is a whole another conversation as far as like from law enforcement. Why would you not want that? But just something else in 2015, MAIP helped convince the DC Council not to move forward on a bill that would have reduced compensation for DC exonerees. It's like you take their time, something they will never get back, and then on top of that, you want to, there was a bill, I guess, to reduce the cost of how much compensation they would receive?
Yeah, compensation is one of those issues that is never, like no one ever admits that they don't want to compensate wrongfully convicted people, but when you start talking to government officials about how much compensation costs, there are usually very quiet efforts to make it less generous, if it's generous or exists at all, which it doesn't in every state. So in DC prisoners, because the federal government is involved and the DC government is involved, in theory, can collect compensation from both the federal government and the DC government. And that 2015 bill, you know, it is reasonable in a lot of contexts to have what they call an offset provision. So like if you win, you know, to like sort of even it out a little bit, like if you win a big lawsuit, maybe the state doesn't pay you quite as much, you know, kind of make it a little bit more manageable. But if I'm remembering correctly, the 2015 bill really went beyond that and took what was a really generous and fair DC compensation statute and tried to kind of gut that, essentially.
Wow. That's so sad. You just think about if someone is wrongfully convicted, they spend 15, 20 years in jail. If they had children, there are proms, graduations, marriages, children, holidays, birthdays, dinners, hugs, kisses, things that they will never get back. There are relationships that are broken that might be impossible to mend. There might be children or family members that pass away that they will never be able to, funerals that they can't attend.
Almost every one of our clients talks about a family funeral they couldn't attend. It's awful.
It is. So you just think about the fact that someone would think that you want too much money.
Right. It is, I mean, the struggle we had to go through to get Maryland to pass even a compensation bill that worked at all to compensate people. I mean, at least DC didn't want to get rid of it entirely. Maryland really just wanted to avoid compensating people at all. And no one would admit it publicly.
Gosh.
But it took us at least 3 legislative sessions and probably more to create a fair and functioning compensation system in Maryland.
And that's really heartbreaking because in preparation for this show, it says either on your website or about MAIP that for Maryland, Maryland has the highest rate of incarcerated Black men. 70% of inmates are Black men, but they only make up 30% of the state's overall population. So if there is an instance where someone has been wrongfully convicted, the fact that we had to pull Maryland's teeth to make them compensate these people, do better, Maryland.
Yes,
do
they are doing
Maryland.
better. Dolores Kennedy and Will Smith, not that Will Smith, but Senator Will Smith in Maryland, really came together and made sure Maryland got it done.
Wow.
And the effort was led by a person who spent 39 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And the bill appropriately is named after him. It's the Walter Lomax Act.
The Walter Lomax Act. Wow.
And he is an amazing guy, and even after he got compensated, kept pushing to make sure everybody else did too.
And it's just so interesting. That's something that we were talking about before the show. It's just that how do you, and I'm sure there are people who feel this way, but how do you come out of a situation like that not bitter? How do you come out and you want to help? Like,
yeah, our clients are amazing.
Oh my gosh.
Like, I am so lucky that I get to do this work. You know, I think we were talking before this about a client of ours named Thomas Hainsworth, who spent 27 years in prison for 3 rapes and sexual assaults that he didn't commit. Wow. And we had, one of the cases involved DNA evidence, and it proved that that woman was inaccurate in her identification. I mean, it was not her fault, right? She made a mistake, but she felt awful. And at some point wanted to meet him to apologize in person. So I set up a meeting between the two of them, and she was petrified. I mean, just petrified. And, you know, apologized, and it was tearful and beautiful. And he just looked at her and he was like, I'm not mad. Like, you know, if I, like, those 27 years, if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have the life I have now, and I have a great life.
Wow, I think that is just so tremendous. When we get back, I want to continue that conversation about the Thomas Hainsworth case and then other legislative work that your organization has done. Please make sure you come back and join us for our final segment of Inside Scoop as we continue our conversation with the Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project. Please make sure you don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Every day across America, excess food is gathered by a network of good people at local food banks, giving hope to millions of children who struggle with hunger. They've earned their wings, and you can too. Together, we can solve child hunger. Support Feeding America and your local food bank at feedingamerica.org.
Hi, I'm Josh Temple. You might have seen me on TV where I help folks turn their houses into dream homes. But forget construction. Parenting is the toughest job there is. So when you need help or advice, turn to the parenting experts at Boys Town.
I was afraid of that.
Well, guess it's time to get you fixed.
Your pets will start fooling around sooner than you think.
Go on, get out of here!
Accidental litters lead to millions killed in shelters each year. Help prevent more. Fix at month 4.
Food. It nourishes, brings us together, and adds flavor to life. That's why it's important to wash hands, surfaces, and fresh produce. Keep raw meat, poultry, and seafood separate from ready-to-eat foods like fruits and vegetables. And cook to proper temperatures using a food thermometer. Enjoy, and refrigerate leftovers within 2 hours. For more tips on safely preparing foods, visit homefoodsafety.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Thank you so much for coming back to the Inside Scoop with our final segment with the Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, Shawn Armbrust. So before we left, we were talking about the unfortunate case of Thomas Hainsworth. You said something interesting. You said that she made a mistake. Mm-hmm. And I just think that for some folks, it's just like, oh, okay, well, she made a mistake. And the other people are just like, well, it's not just too easy to say that. I think about Emmett Till.
That was not a mistake.
It was not.
Right.
But there are some people who might feel like, well, mistaken identity or is okay. But you said Thomas spent 27 years in jail over a mistake. And was it a mistake? Was it something that she said repeatedly? If it's something that you are attesting to repeatedly, was it a mistake?
So some of this is about the psychology of memory, which I'm not going to get fully into. Yeah. But what happens is when you are, experiencing a traumatic event, you are, doing your best to kind of observe the person. But, if the person has a weapon, you're probably a little focused on the weapon. It's pretty traumatic. If it's cross-racial, we are bad at identifying people of different races, and white people are particularly bad at it. So if you look at the exonerations in rape cases, you will see that just a huge percentage of them are white females and black perpetrators, even though those are a tiny percentage of actual rapes. Wow. So, and there are things that happen in the identification process that make this problem worse. So the way police put together lineups and sort of go about the way they do this kind of allows people to make mistakes. It almost encourages them. So, again, I'm not going to get all the way into it, but the way I've heard it described by someone who was in this position was, after the crime, I'm asked to do a composite sketch. And I'm choosing from 10 noses, and there are millions of nose shapes, but I've got 10. And I'm choosing eyebrow shape, and there are all of the eyebrow shapes, but I've got 10. And I'm choosing skin tone, and there are so many gradations of skin tone, but I've got like light, medium, or dark. Wow. And once the composite is done, the composite becomes the image of the perpetrator in my mind. And then the police show me 6 photos. And the traditional way this has been done is you look at 6 photos at the same time. And the way the brain works, it's like a multiple choice test. If none of the above isn't an option, you don't answer none of the above. You're not writing in none of the above. So you're choosing the person who looks most like the perpetrator. And at that point, the perpetrator is the composite sketch. But even if there's no composite sketch, you're still choosing the person who looks most like the perpetrator, not necessarily the perpetrator. And at that point, oftentimes, police will give you feedback. And not always, sometimes it's bad, right? Sometimes it's like intentionally bad. Sometimes it's like, oh, good job, that's the guy we thought. Which, in the moment probably doesn't seem like a big deal. But what it does is make the eyewitness way more confident in their identification. Juries and judges and the US Supreme Court think that witness confidence is incredibly important when determining accuracy, even though we know that other than like that moment where you're making an identification, confidence isn't important after that. So it really is like someone trying to do the thing you're supposed to do and identify the right shooter or rapist or whatever it is, and they legitimately do make a mistake. So even though it's hard to like wrap your head around it, this is why in the National Registry of Exonerations, there are 2 categories. There is eyewitness error, and then there is witness perjury. Wow. So that is for someone who says, you know, we have cases where people just made up an allegation, right? Or like knew it wasn't the guy, this wasn't the guy, but they got a deal in exchange for testifying. Wow. That's a horse of a different color, and that's a different category. But in Thomas's case, these were people who like thought they had the right guy, and they didn't. Wow. So he's incredible.
Wow. So speaking of Thomas, because of his case, you also have on your website that the MAIP worked with the Virginia Attorney General and the Innocence Project to lower the standard for a writ of actual innocence, making it more achievable in the wake of the decision in his case. And I thought something was really interesting that you have. The change also allowed the Attorney General to present evidence of innocence instead of just evidence of guilt.
Yes. So there have been two separate sets of changes to the writ of actual innocence. And the first one stemmed directly from Thomas Hainsworth's case. So in that case, he had been convicted of crimes, two crimes in Richmond and one in Henrico County, like right over the border. Both Commonwealth's attorneys believed Thomas was innocent. And Ken Cuccinelli was Attorney General at the time. And he also came to believe that Thomas was innocent. He actually did oral arguments with me on Thomas's behalf. And there were real questions raised by the court about whether the Attorney General's office could do that and present evidence that someone was innocent. We're so used to the system being adversarial that we sometimes don't know what to do when it's not. So after Thomas's case, we worked with the Attorney General's office to change that, and then also to very, very slightly lower the standard for winning a writ of actual innocence. It used to be just insurmountably high, and it became like really high. Wow. And 2 people were freed because of that change. But even then, the standard was still just so much higher than a person can really meet. And the courts really treated it as almost higher than the standard you have to meet to secure a conviction. So working with the Innocence Project and the UVA Innocence Project, we worked to change that. And also, I have to say, Delegate Charneil Herring, who was amazing. So we eventually got that changed, and it's a much fairer standard now. And I really think there are huge benefits to that. One of our clients, Michael Haas, was exonerated under that new standard, and he didn't do it. It was pretty clear that he didn't do it. The Attorney General's office, this current Attorney General's office, joined us. But under the old standard, he probably wouldn't have won, even with a newly elected conservative Attorney General taking office.
Gosh. Again, I think that's just a testament to the great work that your organization does. You mentioned the UVA Innocence Project, which is a great segue into one of our final questions for this show. What can folks do to help your organization? I understand that lawyers can work pro bono, essentially. Law students can help as well, and the community. So what are some options for those 3 groups?
So I'm an executive director, so I'm very bad at my job if I don't tell people to donate. www.exonerate.org/donate. But there are also a lot of other ways to get involved with us, but also just get involved with this issue. So you can volunteer to work for us. We have, when I say hundreds, I literally mean hundreds, almost 1,000 pro bono lawyers all over the world doing work for us, helping us review cases, doing all kinds of other stuff. It's tremendously helpful. We have law students who intern for us. We do have a couple of community volunteers who are wonderful. And I think another great way for people to get involved is to follow this issue. So, true crime podcasts are a thing, right? Listen to the Wrongful Conviction podcast on Lava for Good. Watch the Netflix series, The Innocence Files. Read about these cases, learn about these cases, talk to people about these cases, and then don't duck jury duty. I think everybody wants to get out of it, but really what we need is an educated community who can show prosecutors and show kind of the powers that be that if you come to them with kind of shoddy work, they're not gonna convict people. And I think that's incredibly important. And then just show up, get involved in local politics. You know, this is not always a super partisan issue, as evidenced by, you know, we worked with Democrats, we've worked with General Cuccinelli. Get involved in local politics and show people that you care about this.
Absolutely. So what can folks do to contact your organization?
Our website, www.exonerate.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, if Twitter still exists today, LinkedIn. But you can follow us in all of those places, and we are updating our website and hopefully soon launching a storytelling project where we're going to have some short documentaries about our client cases. And that's going to be another great way to follow us.
Wow. Shawn, I have so enjoyed this conversation. I can't wait for it to live on YouTube in perpetuity. But everyone knows this is my favorite part of the show. It is either or, would you rather? So I'm going to ask you some questions, and feel free to give them. I'm going to ask you a question. If you have a quick story to add to it, that's absolutely fine. So, are you an early morning person or a late night person?
Sort of neither, but I like morning better.
Okay.
I am a disaster to wake up. I'm mean and I'm grouchy, but then like morning air and morning light, I just love them. I'm more productive. It's quiet and beautiful. So morning.
Gotcha. Okay. Comedy or horror?
Comedy. My work has enough horror.
I'm sure.
No horror ever.
Okay. Tattoos or piercings?
Neither. I'm so lame.
Gosh, not for you, but just like your preference.
Oh.
Like when you see them on people, maybe.
Piercings.
Piercings, okay.
Yeah, they look fun.
Gotcha. Let's see. Gosh, I have a friend, my best friend. She's got like a piercing, like the little thing in your ear. She's such a trooper.
And the nose ring. I like nose rings. They're so cute.
She's got that too. Movies or books?
Books.
What's your favorite?
Oh God, I can't.
Or what are you reading right now? How about that?
Okay, so right now, I just finished All the Light We Cannot See, which was gorgeous. I'm reading. I don't even know the name of it. I'm reading a book about like some like French history kind of thing. It's totally fascinating. It's basically like reading a reality TV show. The French court was so bonkers. And I'm also reading a book called Trust, which is a fiction book, and I think looks at sort of like, you know, creepy rich family over the years. It started really great. So, and I'm going on vacation. I'm excited to read more.
Great. Okay, last question. Law and Order or Ally McBeal?
Okay, so I like this sort of...
5 seconds.
Okay, Law and Order because it's nuts and bolts, but it's also way too pro-prosecution, and that drives me crazy.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us on Inside Scoop. We'll see you next week. Have a wonderful evening.